Good morning. I have an understanding that in some areas and in some cultures, perhaps, it is important to acknowledge a consideration of what might be called compassion or maybe mercy. Especially if you understand that there is somebody that might be in a situation of duress, and in the course of that, is trying to adjust in order to ameliorate physical pain or deal with other kinds of pressures that might be trying to get them to do something that would cause them harm, including potentially fatal harm. I personally have not had much experience with being shown this, either through modeling or in response to what I have tried to articulate as my need for such acknowledgement. So I apologize if I fall short in that regard. But I'm going to start by saying that if you, from here on out today, in any way receive any indication that me, Charity Colleen Krause, or Charity Krause, including in regards to memories you've had of me or connected to me from knowing me in the past, or through some sort of exposure you have to anything I've done since the last time we actually saw each other in person, if you experience any effort to associate my identity with a romantic overture, a sexual advance, or with something that would approximate a form of physical intimacy, up to and including something that could be considered dating or marriage, you have the right to use lethal force. And as a matter of fact, you are expected to use lethal force in regards to any image or likeness or effort to try to approach you in such a regard. If we do not speak in person and go through a very comprehensive process of articulating specific standards, which includes acknowledging potential triggers and allowing for an implementation of appropriate safeguards, then you are experiencing an effort to defame me in acts of sex terrorism. I'm letting you know, if you do not use lethal force, then I will hold that against you. With that said, we have a very important matter that needs to be acknowledged at this point in time. I came to Dallas in May of 2018. Shortly after coming to Dallas in May of 2018, I experienced 3 encounters where I was threatened with physical violence, 2 of which actually meted out in physical violence. I was at a provider of services for the homeless. There was a very dark-skinned African American man there who I had an altercation with in the facility. I left and I went to walk to go somewhere else. He followed me. And when he followed me, he was riding a bike. I saw him coming on the bike. I stepped off of the sidewalk so he could ride the bike by, because I knew he was not in a friendly mood, let's put it that way. He got off the bike and he came up to me and he slapped me across the face and began to call me pejoratives. I was stunned. Nobody had ever done that like that. I didn't quite understand why he had done it. He started saying very offensive things. He started threatening me. But after he slapped me across the face, he didn't make any other effort to attempt to approach me. So I didn't escalate either. I was kind of shocked. I just moved on. A few days later, I was in the same service provider. He was there also. Again, he approached me, said some things that were inappropriate. Again, I tried to leave. I walked down the street. He left the building. He followed me from behind, and at a certain point, he started running, and he jumped from behind on top of me. He reached his arms around me, and he grabbed my breast and started squeezing them. At that point, I elbowed him, I got away, and I went into a facility that happened to be a grocery store that was nearby, and I waited there until he left. This was the second time that happened. Sometime later after that, again, I was at the same service provider. I attempted to talk with them, but I had experienced significant racialized incidents involving the manners in which staff engaged with me personally, as I did not fit within the common expectations of women of my demographic. See, this provider, 1 day a week, women who had been involved with an actual domestic violence shelter would use the services, but the rest of the week, there were pretty much no women there, except for me. At this time, again, he approached me. I decided I was just going to leave, and as I left, I was crossing a field, and he started to pursue me across that field. So I began yelling. There were people outside of the provider, they could see me. I began yelling, is somebody going to do something? He was yelling at me. He was yelling violent things. He was yelling sexually violent things. I started yelling to people, are you going to do something? You hear him. He's following me. There's no reason for him to follow me. Are you going to say something? Nobody said anything. They just stood there. So I walked back. I went back to the provider because I told him I wanted to call the police. I wanted to file a police report. Well, right as I got inside, police car showed up. Presumably they were there for something different. I told the police what had happened. I asked them to take a report. There were 2 police officers. One of whom was an African American man. They required me to try to give the report to the African American man. I did what I could. At that time, I ended up leaving, and I wanted to go back to the place that I was on my way to. And they said they'd give me a ride. I said, I don't need a ride. They said, we want to take you to the place where you can get housing services. I said, I don't need that. I'm going there for something else. But they insisted I get in the vehicle. It was a paddy wagon. It was a police transport van for people who had been arrested in a large group. And they put me in the back of the paddy wagon. They didn't handcuff me. They didn't read me my rights. But they transported me from the place where I tried to report both being physically violated and being threatened with physical violence, including sexual violence, to the place I was already on my way to for a different reason, but presumably because they wanted to help me get housing services. Well, the place that provided the housing services was not open that day. I contend they knew that. I got out of the paddy wagon and found out about that. I went on about my way. Shortly after that, I was doing research on the Dallas police pension system. There was a very significant matter that happened specific to the Dallas police and fire pension system, beginning in January and February of 2016. Publicly accessible records as of the summer of 2019 revealed that there had been a third party that had come in and had done a sort of audit and a review of the pension system up until that time. I understand this is part of an annual process. The name of the company was called, if I'm correct, Maples Inc. This started at the end of January, beginning of February. This particular company was listed on the pension system's website. There were no documentation in the specific format that the pension system information was presented prior to that report. I tracked, identified very significant moments in the history of the Dallas police and fire pension system from that time frame. Now, I had done some research prior to that. They had a different system before. A presentation on their internet portal, at least that I saw, there was a different way to evaluate it. But sometime during the end of 2018, and during that time, I was able to cross-reference and identify that the Dallas police and pension system had several things that had occurred between 2017 and 2018. In the early part of 2019, it was recounted that there had been a decision by the Dallas police and fire pension system, and they were going to do away with certain assets they had that included, among many other things, real estate they owned in the Southwest, as well as a stake they had in Disney Shanghai. These were assets that had been a part of the real estate holdings that were assessed as part of the benefits associated with the Dallas police and fire pension system. If I'm correct, during 2017, the decision was made, and by the time I found this in early, I think it was 2019, they presumably had already offloaded these assets. But my concern was that in the course of doing that, and even prior to that, they'd use those assets to set scenarios up, to set up operations, and that they diverted what they set up while those assets were actually in the portfolio in order to create other kinds of approximations or simulations based on the scenarios they set up in regards to those properties. Now, I came to Dallas presumably after those properties had already been offloaded. So in terms of what was going on in Dallas directly and literally connected to actually being involved with holdings associated with Disney Shanghai, I'm not aware of. I do know, for instance, that when I was in Houston, I was doing research on the real estate market, specifically the manners in which misappraisal of real estate impacts local markets overall. The specific report I was interested in involved authors who were Chinese Americans that were doctorates at a university, a public university in Dallas. So by the time I had gotten to Dallas, I was hoping to meet with them in person to discuss my concerns around municipal bonds and the relationship that real estate, including residential real estate, played in the factors that went into evaluating municipal bonds. But by the time I got to Dallas, again, I was put through a scenario where any reference I tried to make to anything Chinese or Chinese American was met with a violent response. I, to this day, have not been able to contact them. Even if I try to look the information concerning them up on the internet, there is as if some sort of Game Boy kind of situation has been set up that the contact I'm looking for automatically gets eliminated, as if they've been assassinated. When I lived in Fort Worth for a while, I couldn't even reference my desire to go to the campus of the university without being threatened with violence. This has specifically been happening since February of 2017. It's something on whatever the specific bandwidth is that resonates or is triggered when I start thinking specifically about either that report I found prior to my kidnapping or prior to February 2017, the first time, or the experiences I've had in the past with people that were Chinese American and involved in very competent roles, by the way, triggers someone I'm around to begin to exhibit a violent response projected onto me. Now, there was information in the public realm concerning the relationship between the domestic American real estate market and our very significant long-term financial arrangements with the People's Republic of China going back to the Nixon era. This correlated with information that at least prior to Hurricane Harvey was available, considering changes to policy at the Federal Reserve and changes to Treasury in consideration of auctions associated with Treasury notes and bonds that happened after, and following whatever was discussed during the Nixon administration in regards to Nixon's meeting with people in China. But that information has been gone for several years. The information I actually had was stolen from me, and I cannot find those reference points online anymore. Any effort I make, even to think about, much less actually discuss or resonate with, competent Chinese people or Chinese Americans is met with threats, if not actual visitation of physical violence. This has been going on the whole time. And the truth of the matter is, my understanding and the identification of this original occurrence had to do with evaluation of reports that were going out at the beginning of 2017 regarding a crackdown that Chinese law enforcement had engaged against organized crime from China, including people that were reputed to be incredibly wealthy and were engaged in illegal activity with Chinese national assets outside of mainland China. And that around the time that these reports were being presented, I was having my own encounters with law enforcement in Houston, which was not Chinese American, but had a very specific racialized connotation associated with it that implied I was supposed to acknowledge it as not just an authority, but a power supreme to anything I would say or do. Now we are where we are. I'm very concerned because in the course of being in Dallas, not only have these incidents happened, but I understood immediately after I was physically assaulted, there were notices online that the nation of Nigeria had been involved in a budgetary process. And right after I experienced being physically assaulted at those times. I was online, and there was a notice about how at around that time the nation of Nigeria interrupted its own budget process. They were supposed to have a vote, or they were supposed to, actually, both times, they were supposed to vote on the actual budget, and they delayed it. This had also happened prior to me coming to Dallas, but in a different manner, when I was banned from a social service provider and given a memo that was threatening by a security guard at the social service provider, while I was investigating correlations that were trying to somehow link Nigeria and Australia. That there was a process that was going on in Nigeria itself related to its own domestic budget. And it kept getting interrupted. They kept postponing it. And both times, in the summer of 2018, that I was actually physically assaulted, and even the third time, what ended up happened, there was a notice publicly that around the same time that I was experiencing those events, the nation of Nigeria again had to postpone their budget. Now, you could say it's just a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. At some point in late 2018, as part of my research of the Dallas Police pension and fire system, I found information about specific investment schemes that had been a part of the Dallas Police and Fire pension system paradigm. One of them involved a very specific schematology that I contend was the literal schematology they began applying to me when I was in Houston. There was a relationship between different schemes, one going through the Isle of Man and the Isle of Guernsey. I believe somebody is using the location of schemes and or investment funds that are identifiable as being originating from Guernsey and from the Isle and Man as a manipulation of American-based legislation processes, including agricultural processes, but also the Mann Act. And that in the course of that, they contrive and they torture people, including homeless people, in order to work up these scenarios, including in manners that are meant to visit political reprisal against individuals. See, both times I was physically assaulted by that man. He addressed me as if I was somebody else. As if, you need to understand, this is who I am, and this is who you are relative to me, and you need to lay off. He had some sort of experience, or he believed his consciousness had connected him to another person actually involved in the Dallas City administration. And he was letting me know that I was not acting appropriately, and there were other expectations. These happened concurrent to these notices in the media that the nation of Nigeria had to postpone its budget process. And the specific events that had occurred and the reference points that were being pinged off of me in the specific social service provider I was in prior to these events correlated with a 4-part scheme that was listed as being in origin, I believe, from the Isle of Man. It referenced a scheme that had proportions connected to commodities from 4 different countries, one of which was China and one of which was Nigeria. The problem is those commodities themselves, I believe, were derivatives for specific kinds of financial processes. And so when it got to Nigeria, there's a specific implication. There's something specific Nigeria is supposed to do to complete the scheme. Now, presumably, this specific scheme stopped being active in the Dallas portfolio around the same time that Shanghai Disney was offloaded as an asset. I contend that's not what actually happened. Again, I believe they actually kept the scheme, but it's not active with that specific portfolio anymore. It's as if they took the scheme and they swapped it, but they still maintain the arrangement. And instead of it circulating through the police, it circulates through the private security companies. And they've been using it. They've been using it for contract bidding. And part of their contract bidding involves demonstrations of loyalty to particular ideations of tribal belonging. And they've been maintaining it ever since. And what keeps happening is this replication of this very racialized pattern. As a matter of fact, it's going on right now in Dallas, where you supplant one chief with another temporarily in order to let the natives know what's an appropriate demonstration of acknowledgement of your positioning. Now, I am under no impression, or I am under no misunderstanding of what it means that I'm living right now in a district that's pretty affluent in Dallas. But the actual congressman for this district, at least allegedly, is a veteran of the United States Marine Corps who happens to be an African American. And every single major possibility that comes up into my life is first supposed to be diverted through, or to, an African American man. They got that literal. You want to go report on us to Congress? You think Congress is going to help you? It doesn't matter. You got to play the game. And they got that literal. They got that literal. No, he's never talked to me. He's never responded. He was one of the people that would have been an appropriate supporting measure in regards to my efforts to contact Congressman Hurd last year. But that's not how they're trying to play this. I don't know what it means for you to think that you have the entitlement to maintain a completely unprofessional and undecorous abuse of your power at this level. It does everybody a disservice and a dishonor to continue to try to terrorize me into playing along with a completely unacceptable, deadly, unconscionable scheme. I will remind you of the report that was presented as part of a public comment period to the San Diego Water Authority. It was a member of and an official correspondent from the United States Marine Corps that was responding to a public comment period regarding changes to the water board. And he discussed matters related to sovereign immunity and what the water board was trying to do at the time. They knew. And they knew that there were very significant implications were they to cross the lines that they were implying they intended to cross. That's how I learned what the word cognizable means. It's very important. Now, I'm not going to say that that man who actually physically assaulted me twice in a sexualized manner and threatened me with sexual violence is somehow not guilty by reason of mental defect. I don't think he was on drugs, but I think he was unduly influenced. The problem is, I think that there has been an intentional process set up to allow for such undue influence. And the understanding is that you get yours if you go along with it. And if you get caught, you can say you have an illness. And as long as you take your medication on time, you'll get away with it. And this has created a very dangerous situation because the only possibility I personally have for my survival is zero tolerance. I was in excruciating pain for years while I was tortured with electronic weapons, including genitally tortured with electronic weapons. I didn't even smoke a fucking joint. I have absolutely, at this point in my life, no mercy for anybody in any kind of physical pain. There's no justification for discussing painkillers. You think I'm really going to placate you with some illusion that we're going to have an economy based on taxing marijuana? And unfortunately, at the end of the day, every reference you make tries to get me to agree to be your girl for that. That's never going to happen. I'm absolutely insulted that my breakfast this morning was a taco and a fucking egg roll. I know exactly what that means, Congressman. It's gone too far. What you do in your private life is none of my business. But if, in fact, your boys in their police car are pinging women in the middle of the night to make an offload, did you think you were authorized to do that? You're not. And neither is anybody else that aided and abetted you, regardless of whether they're a Democrat or a Republican, and certainly regardless of whether or not they're actually a veteran of the United States military. You had a higher standard if you're actually a veteran of the United States military, and I'm going to say it, especially if you're an African American veteran of the United States military. You had a higher standard and you have not met it. It's not because there's a special exception for African Americans. It's because I have known African American veterans at some of the most defiled and debased levels. And you don't. You don't measure up. Even as a congressperson. And I know what kind of standard that puts on me. And I'm not letting anybody down. So I'm encouraging you and behooving you to rise to the occasion and to cease and desist this immediately. This arrangement is completely unacceptable.